Hello gamers, Power Deal here, and today we're going to be talking about leveling in the endgame in Classic Plus. So a couple days ago, I made a video talking about some perceived problems that Classic has and things that people want fixed for Classic Plus, essentially. And I talked about how I think in a lot of cases they're not actually problems, right? Things that don't really need to be solved. They're just kind of how the game was originally meant to be, intended to be designed, built, played, all of that stuff. And one of the things that I talked about was leveling, because one of the problems that typically gets brought up whenever this Classic Plus discussion happens is how the game, original WoW, doesn't focus on leveling, and that it's more of an end game focus game than WoW has kind of always been an end game focused game. But the thing is, they bring it up as if this is a sort of problem, you know? And it's my opinion that the game was designed like that intentionally, and that's actually why the game is so successful, right? And I'm kind of gonna make the case for that here, and why I think it would kind of be a mistake to go in the opposite direction. So the first thing is that the end game in this game, there's a clear demarcation between the early game and the end game, because you actually can't even get into certain raids and dungeons until you're level 55. I think the ZG, it's like level 50, so the 20s might be like level 50. And then I think for raids, it's like 55. I know Molten Core is 55. I think I've gotten a message trying to enter AQ solo with a minimum level is like 50, so I don't know if that's different for that. I think the reason why you can't get into Molten Core until 55 is because the attunement is there, right? And even stuff like that. So the attunement quest is only available at like 55. There's an attunement from Blackwing Lair, which I assume is probably only available at level 55 or higher. I doubt it's available below that. So you can see clearly we're structuring the game in a way where you have to be a high level to participate in this content, right? And there's also like a whole separate bracket of gear for level 60 characters. Like the entire game you progress through, right? You're getting gear that's, has a level requirement on it. You have to be a certain level to wield it. This is kind of all the way through, kind of up until the end. And once you get to the end, you start getting into like 20 mans and 40 mans and stuff like that. The gear requires you to be level 60, right? So it's very clear that this is meant to be an end game thing. And they've also made quite a bit of raid content and dungeon content, right? So if you take all the dungeons that are, level 50 and beyond, which is quite a while, is there like Strat, you can count Strat Holden as a whole, but it's really like two dungeons, right? So Strat Live, Strat Undead, Skullomance, then LBRS, BRD I would still count in this, right? BRD is huge. UBRS, right? So just an incredible amount of dungeons, and then there's also raids, right? You have the 220s, and then you have 40-man raids. So a lot of content in Classic, a lot of bosses. And keep in mind, this stuff, it takes more design thought than kind of just making an area of the game, right? Because you have to actually think now about when you're making, like, let's say you're making the Badlands, right? So you have to kind of think about what you want the Badlands to look like, and then you have to populate it with mobs that are, around the level that you want it to be. But you kind of have a general idea of what the characters are going to be doing at that level, right? Because realistically, there's not tons of fluctuations in power for characters that are like in the level like 38 to like 43 range or something like that, right? For something like Molten Core, there's like various gear levels that you can enter this in, right? You can enter it in technically level 55, right? You could enter it with all your pre-bis, and even between those two, there's a huge gap. And then what happens when you start getting gear in Molten Core, right? Do you want it to be super easy? Do you still want it to be a challenge? So there's kind of a lot that goes into designing the endgame, and they designed a ton of it. And the game is also, it's designed in a way where there's a huge difference between level 59 and 60, right? Because of the types of gear you can use. This is not a game that's like a RuneScape at all, where you're maxing out specific stats. Your overall combat level doesn't really matter. It's more about, do you have the requisite skills or abilities or items to be able to defeat this quest, right? And those are all based on having very specific requirements. And WoW, it's more a generalized requirement. That is really essentially what it comes down to, right? And people are going to talk about a lot of time was invested into the leveling content as well, and sure, but you have to keep in mind that was the kind of standard back then, right? This is actually how you created an MMO, and it's sort of interesting to imagine if, like, let's say if they had a bit more knowledge back then of like modern MMOs, would they have actually gone the same route? It's an interesting question to pose. I'm not exactly sure they would have, but they did, and I think that that's mostly because they were using EverQuest as a blueprint, right? And in EverQuest, it's kind of an extremely long journey, a punishing journey in some cases. You can actually lose XP in EverQuest. It's very group-based in EverQuest, and this is something we're going to highlight in a separate video, where I think people love to make this comparison with Classic WoW and RuneScape, right, in the modern day, and talk about horizontal versus vertical progression. A big reason why that doesn't work is that RuneScape is mostly a solo game, and like I said, we'll investigate that in its own video. But yeah, EverQuest there was a lot of grouping, like a lot of, not for every class necessarily, but for some classes they didn't have the luxury of soloing quite as well as others, right? So for the vast majority of players, there was a lot of grouping. It was very reminiscent of Final Fantasy XI, if you guys have ever played that, where I think there's a couple classes, like Beastmaster is a class that can like take control over other monsters and fight them against other monsters in the wild. So that class can kind of solo, but there's not many classes that really do well solo in Final Fantasy XI, and most of the game is you being in a group with like 4 or 5 other players, I forget how many people, and you pull mobs to your group, kind of like in EverQuest really. You have camps, right? And you kind of pull mobs in, and then you fight them, and then you go get another mob, right? So what Classic WoW did is they took a lot of the same, I say, very basic principles, but they made the game much more soloable, much more casual. And it always makes me laugh when people talk about, Classic WoW as being this like leveling focused game, and that the end game, it's all about the journey to level 60, and there's no journey beyond level 60, right? Which is also weird. It's like people have to characterize it as like they put so much emphasis on the early leveling that there's almost like no conception that there can still be a journey that's going on after your character hits max level and unlocks the ability to do everything in the game. And I think in Classic, that's really the thing, is like once you hit 60, you unlock more things. So naturally, that's why I think more people enjoy time at the end game. Like there's always this misconception, I think, that everybody just wants to rush to the end game, almost like they're rushing to the end of a race. See, for me personally, it's not really about that. It's more about the fact that a lot of the things that I want to do in the end game, some of the more lucrative farms, even stuff like PvP, these things all feel better at max level because your character at that point is finished, at least in the most basic sense. It's almost like the character's brain has developed, right? If you're doing that, how people always say, oh, your brain finishes developing at 25. That doesn't mean that you stop gaining like wisdom after 25, right? It just means like your baseline cognition is maybe sort of formed at that point, right? And this is a super oversimplification, but you kind of get the idea here, right? So like by level 60, the baseline of your character is formed, and then you can augment it from there with gear and stuff, but you have all your abilities, right? Like playing a rogue at 30 versus playing a rogue at 60 is vastly different. And this is why actually I hated the level bands in SOD. I hated it because I didn't like running around playing a level 25 rogue. It just felt terrible, It felt much better at level 60. I didn't even have like a hit cap, so things like my ambush could miss, right? Like things were just like missing all over the place that shouldn't be missing. It was really silly. And I think that's a lot of the reason why people actually want to get max level, right? It's not all to do with like just finishing the content or just finishing a race. It opens up the freedom to do whatever you want, right? Because the thing is like all those things that you couldn't do before are sort of locked behind leveling. And I think that's always going to be the case no matter what, right? Because every game is going to have some sort of progression system. So it'd be kind of weird if like you could farm the best fish in the game from level 1. It would be kind of weird if you could mine the best mining node in the game from level 1, especially with like minimal or low effort. Like it's hard to conceptualize how that would really work, right? So again, hitting max to me, I think to a lot of players, is more about just unlocking everything that you can do in the game rather than just arbitrarily crossing a finish line. But yeah, I was making the comparison earlier to EverQuest, obviously, and yeah, people just they always they think of this game and it's like, oh, it's about the leveling and all that stuff. But the funniest part to me, and I've said this in the previous video, is that this game is sort of like a truncated version of EverQuest, right? Where I think that they looked back and they saw what happened with EverQuest, right? Where the game was kind of so ambiguous and it was so RPG heavy. Like they didn't even have quest markers and stuff like that. Like you had to actually talk to the NPCs as if you were interacting with them. It was really immersive in that kind of roleplay aspect, right? And they made a deliberate design decision, like we're not going to be quite as immersive, right? We're going to give the player a lot more direction, but that's going to get a lot more players into the game. And we think that they're going to like the core of the game in other ways, even if maybe the RPG elements aren't quite as fleshed out as you would have in like a paper or like mud RPG or something like that, right? Because they really did simplify a lot of things, and the leveling is just one of them, right? Like, in other words, this game, it's meant to be a theme park. It's meant to be something that streamlines you through to the end game. Now, naturally, because it was one of the earlier MMOs, there's still going to be a type of sandbox component there, right? A lot of the sandbox elements still exist to some degree, but the main focus is still very much theme park, and you can tell because they want it to be a relatively guided experience, you know? And if they didn't, they just would have built the game in a different way. So it's just always bizarre to me how everybody has this opinion of like, oh, well, they didn't really care if anybody hit endgame, it's just about being in the world and stuff like that. It's like, well, I think they cared quite a lot, because they constructed the game in a way where it would be way easier for you to get to endgame than in any of the predecessors that kind of came before it. Like WoW was definitely the easiest game to hit max level in of the serious games at the time. Like if you want to look at Final Fantasy XI, if you want to look at EverQuest, it was definitely like less intuitive hitting level 60 in those two games, right? It would be way easier to find your way to 60 in 2004. And I was a little kid when I played the game, and I, not like a little kid, but like I wasn't used to playing MMOs or anything like that, right? And I was still relatively young, and it was very easy for me even to find my way through the game. So I think to their credit, they essentially did a pretty good job back then, right? But yeah, I never felt, even back then, I don't have this, like, even back then I remember like wanting to get to the end game. That was like a big thing because I knew that they had boss monsters where you could collaborate with other players and you had to team up to figure out how to kill them, and you got like these really cool items that made you stronger in PvP and in the raid and all this stuff. And I wanted to see what it was like to be in those raids and communicate and cooperate with all those people, right? So I think even back then, the raids were built in a way where it was like, you wanted to get there, and it was super enticing. It wasn't just about the leveling journey. I never felt that. I never felt like, oh wow, I'm gonna be so depressed when I hit max level or something like that, or and the journey is over, because to me it didn't really feel like the journey is over because I never felt like I was on a directed journey to begin with. It was like a make my own adventure, and the whole point was just to explore the game and stuff like that, And yeah, the other thing that I kind of don't get, that I've wanted to ask people who are like super into the leveling, which maybe this video title got their attention, right, is let's say that they did put maybe a bit of a de-emphasis on leveling, right? So you get through to the end game quicker in Classic Plus. how would that harm the people who really do like leveling and the leveling community? I genuinely don't understand it, because if you truly love leveling and that's like something that you really enjoy, you can just level as many alts as you want, right? And I think people talk about pacing sometimes, and they're worried about, oh, the pacing of the game would be ruined because you don't have to hit all the areas. I don't think that's a bad thing either, right? Because you can always hit the areas on another character, right? It doesn't make any sense to me how you should have to stop in every zone on your journey to level 60. I actually think it's kind of cool if it's the opposite, right? Where you kind of don't go into every zone on your journey to level 60, and then there's still some mystery to be had when you're level 60. You know, maybe you hit level 60 and you're like, oh, I never went to that zone. I wonder what's in there. And you go over there to check it out or something, right? So I don't really understand this obsession with like needing to hit all the zones and, you know, needing to kind of drag the leveling out over a specific number of zones. Because like I said, you can just make your own route to 60 every time. Like if they make the leveling shorter and it takes less zones to get to 60, you can construct your next alt leveling plan, you know, to go through different zones. And even if you don't want to play like a different class, you could just make the same class and go through the leveling again, you know? And if the leveling is shorter, it wouldn't even take you as long to get to the part where you divulge. Typically, you can divulge and pick different leveling areas by like level 10 or 12 or 13, right? So it doesn't take barely any time to get to there. So if you made a paladin and you get to 60 in a certain way, and you wanted to have a different path to 60, you could easily just make another paladin, get to level 13, and branch out to a different route, right? So I just don't understand how, you know, I feel like what it is it's like you just want to hold back all the people. I think that a lot of people that have this leveling fascination, right? I think for some of them, they still do like the end game, but what they want is they want to restrict other people to their pace of playing the game. In other words, like they want to be able to take as much time as they want to hit level 60, and they don't want to feel behind once they hit level 60. And I think like that is just a very unrealistic and kind of problematic way to view and look at the game, right? Because it's a persistent world at the end of the day. That's the whole point of this game, right? Is that time goes on when you're not playing, or if you choose to do a certain thing, there's an opportunity cost to every choice you make, you know? Like if you want to go and explore the world, if that's fun to you, that's perfectly fine. But if somebody else is leveling the whole time that you're, you know, just running around looking for cool things to find in the world, how can you then be upset when they are progressed quicker than you in the game, right? It doesn't make any sense. So to me, it seems like if you're going to be that type of person that wants to really take the leveling slow and enjoy it and enjoy the discovery and all that stuff, you have to be at peace with the fact that some people are just going to be out leveling you and progressing through the game quicker. And presumably, if those things were important to you, right? The discovery and all that stuff, if those are the primary things that are important to you, then you wouldn't feel bad about somebody usurping you in other aspects of the game, right? Like, why would you care if somebody progressed faster than you, got to level 60 quicker or something like that, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. So, yeah, I just don't understand why the whole idea is that we're going to hold everybody back at a certain point, you know, and I think that this is what they wanted to do. This is what they kind of experimented with in SOD, and in SOD, I think a lot of people actually ended up quitting the game because what happened was you just held all these people back in certain brackets, and they didn't have the freedom to really play the game how they wanted because they were stuck at level 25, they were stuck at level 40, they were stuck at level 50, and ironically, those became their own end games anyway. Right, so even when you were at level 25, there was still a whole end game based around 25, and now at level 25, it probably wasn't a problem, right? Because going from 1 to 25 is really quick. But let's say you're not a very fast player. Once you hit the 40 or the 50 bracket, and you have a rate at the end of those brackets, right, it can still take you maybe quite a bit of time to climb from level 40 to 50, or it might still take you time to climb from 50 to 60 or whatever it is, right? So, you know, at that point, you're still going to be behind in whatever bracket you're tied to at that point. It doesn't really matter all that much. Now, one caveat is that I do think that the pressure to kind of hit 60 initially in any fresh release can be a little bit uncomfortable, right? So I think that what they've been doing, and they've been doing this for other versions of the game, right? They did it for Classic Fresh, and they did it for, I think they even did, no, they didn't do it for 2019, but they did it for Psalm, I believe, and they did it for Anniversary, is they just made it so that there's like a, what is that, 2 week or 3 week window before the raids come out, and they've been doing this in retail expansions as well, even though the leveling is much faster in retail. So what happens is that you just have more time to hit 60 before you actually get behind gear wise, because for a lot of people I think that that's the main concern. Like the economy in Classic, it's not that it's completely irrelevant, but it's more supplemental than primary, right? Like you don't need to have a really robust economic advantage to kind of stay on the same playing field as somebody in this game. Even if you're unable to get all the consumes because you didn't really have a good economic start, in most cases you can get by with only getting certain ones, and once you do that, you'll pretty much be fine. So even if you maybe don't have every consume like somebody else in your raid does, the gap between you and that person is not huge. But what would kind of make the gap a little bit bigger is have them having more gear than you, is sort of the idea, right? And I think everybody gets a little bit upset because it's not just about the gear, but it's some of these items are quite rare and you only get one shot at them every reset. So the idea is like, oh, if I missed the first like 2 or 3 resets, then I missed 2 or 3 opportunities of that item, and that feels really bad. So I think that's the whole logic that they use in trying to make it so that the raids are not available for the first 2 or 3 resets, and I think that's fine. Like I'm a player that usually gets there like very fast, so normally I'd probably be in time for the first or second reset or whatever the standard is for the players that are pushing hard, right? I mean, in some versions of the game, it's probably not even possible. Like if you made a new version of Classic Plus and the idea was the leveling journey was longer, maybe it wouldn't even be possible to do the raid on week 1, even if it was there, right? But even as a player who normally pushes, I have no problem with them implementing this thing, right? Because it's just kind of like a feel-good thing that everybody can kind of start the raids at the same time, or maybe not everybody, but most people. So I don't mind like some restrictions on things like that. I just don't like the crazy restrictions we had in SOD. And I think that, blocking the raid for like 3 to 4 weeks or whatever, I think that'd be a pretty fair compromise. Give people time to kind of level up and, yeah, make it so that even if you're not doing a trailblazing pace through the game, then you have time to actually get to the end game. There's also probably going to be lots of launch issues and bugs and stuff like that. So all of that stuff just kind of exacerbate frustrations if like you're really trying to push to, get into raids on like week 1 or 2, and you have these catastrophic server issues or something like that, right? And now this is delaying your progress. You're unable to do that. It feels really bad. So yeah, I think that like I'd say 2 to 3 or even 4 week period, if you want to go a month before raids release, that's absolutely fine. I'll still have plenty to do in the game. Leveling alts, PvP, gold farming, all that stuff will be fine, right? But yeah, I don't really think there's a way to solve this thing of, people outpacing other people with leveling. And I just don't think that leveling is ever intended to be the only goal of the game, right? And surely Blizzard doesn't care if you guys only want to level, right? If you guys only want to level, it's however you want to spend your $15 a month, right? However you find value in the game, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that it's wrong of you to want to play the game that way. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it's just, I don't think that the focus of Blizzard should be on people who only explicitly want to play one subsection of the game when everybody else wants to play the entirety of the game, if that makes sense. That doesn't mean they're going to make the leveling bad. Or, like I said, you guys are probably going to get a lot more quests and stuff like that. The leveling is going to be more robust and filled out than it's ever been. But to want them to drag out the leveling process, specifically for the people who just love leveling exclusively, I just don't understand. And it just kind of, it alienates the players who don't find that as fun, right? Because they're forced to do that no matter what. Like, keep in mind that it's not a there's a bit of an asymmetry here, right? That I think that the levelers don't quite understand, because you guys get to start leveling from the very start of the game, right? That's the whole first part of the game. So if you like leveling, you have that for the whole first part of the game, and you can repeat that ad nauseum as many times as you want. Like I was saying on alts or whatever, right? If you're somebody who really enjoys endgame raids, endgame PvP, endgame dungeons, or just anything that you can do at endgame, like farming gold at the maximally efficient way possible, right? Farming the highest level herbs and the highest level mining nodes and stuff like that. If that's who you are, then you're comparatively not going to be enjoying leveling as much because you're not doing what you want to do. Try and think of it as like an ARPG, right? Where you have a build that you want to do, but for some reason the developers made it only accessible in the end game of the ARPG, right? And this happens with PoE sometimes, right? Where the skills that you want to use, they're just not viable in the early portion of the game because grinding gear games does a terrible job sometimes at balancing the skills at various points, right? It would be a real slog to use them through the campaign. So what you do is you use other skills that aren't quite as fun for you to get through the campaign quicker, to be able to use the skills that you really want to use, right? And it's not fun, those like 1 to 50 to 60 levels. And in a game like PoE, it's still relatively fast, right? But even in that game, like sometimes I'll have to use skills that I don't really like to get to the end game quicker, and I don't really like it that much. Whenever I can, whenever the difference isn't like that drastic, I'll just use the skill that I want to play, but sometimes it is quite bad. So whenever I'm in one of those scenarios, I'm just kind of hating life for those first 1 to 60 levels or however long it is. And a lot of people can quit and get disinterested in that time, even in a game like PoE, right? Which is, it doesn't take long to kind of hit even close to high level in that game. So just think about a game like WoW, where realistically, I think a lot of people use the term 5 days played to get to max. For your average player, like I said, even experienced players that aren't really hyper focused on the leveling, a lot of it's going to be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 days played for them to hit max level. And think about 12 days of in-game play time, right? So it's not like you've just been playing the game for 12 days. You've probably been playing the game, if you have normal responsibilities at this point, for a month and a half, 2 months. And you've been playing for this period and you haven't really liked what you're doing, right? Like maybe it hasn't been the worst experience in the world, but you want to get to endgame and do the things that you want to do, and you already haven't been able to do that for like a month or a month and a half. That's kind of crazy, right? There's no other game that has that precedent. Yeah, there's no other game that has that precedent. It's crazy when you think about it. Like imagine if it took you like a month and a half before you could unlock the champion that you wanted to play in like League of Legends and Valorant, right? That'd be crazy, right? How many people would stick around to do that, right? So I feel like people, for the most part, in WoW, they're already kind of good sports about it, especially Classic WoW, right? If you're the type of person that's playing WoW Classic, you're used to and ready to invest a lot of time, if you're an endgame person, doing stuff that you may not like in the early game just to get to the endgame. And for you guys to want to, you have like no sympathy for those people at all, it seems like, right? You just want to go harder with that, right? You don't want to reduce it even a little bit for them, and you want to drag it out for them even more, right? And like, trust me, guys, if you make it so it takes like 15, 17, 20 days for the average player, let's just call it 15, right? If you, or maybe even like, yeah, I think 15 is probably, because like I think the average player, again, is probably still anywhere from like 10 to 12 days played, honestly. So let's say it's like 15 in Classic Plus. You guys would be in a rude awakening for how many people quit this game. That's all I'm saying. And also, the longer it takes, too, the more spread out the people are getting to 60, which kind of it harms the kind of like the grouping capabilities, right? Because usually there's kind of like layers and clumps of players that hit at the same time, right? There's the people that are really pushing, then kind of like the next wave after that, then the next wave after that. And the longer you extend the grind, the more you make it into like a true marathon. Basically, each one of those groups becomes thinner and thinner and thinner, so you have less and less players to group with at each stage. So what ends up happening is by the time you get to the end game or you get close to the end game and you're kind of doing these sort of end game activities, there's just less players for you to group up with. That is the reality because there's a bunch of players that are still behind you at various levels of progress, and there's various groups of players that have already done everything in front of you, right? So now you have even less players than you did before to kind of do all of the end game content with, right? And like, if you're a player that's like really, really slow, again, making the leveling slower is not going to save you, right? Because maybe what you're thinking is like, I hate the fact that everybody rushes to endgame, and I'm always that person where everybody is level 60 and I'm level 40, and by the time I get to level 60, the dungeon bisque grind and stuff like that is it's pretty much past its heyday. It's harder for me to get groups and stuff like that. Well, if you make the game longer, it's just going to be even harder for that to happen, right? I mean, you're just going to struggle even more because there's going to be less people with you there. Like, more people are going to have already done everything already, And there's going to be even less people for you to play with. And people are now less incentivized to make alts because it was such a grueling slog to get to max level. Now nobody wants to play an alt. So in another system where maybe you were level 40 and they were level 60, but they're leveling an alt, maybe their alt actually catches up to you and their alt is running with you on your main doing pre-bis farming, right? That is never going to happen in a system where you have a super drawn out leveling process where people are just like, thank God I got through that, And then they just never look back. They're like, are you making an alt? No way. Can you boost? Nope. Okay. Never making an alt in this game, right? It's just unhealthy for the game. The healthiest thing is to have the leveling be a little shorter and to have there be a huge turnaround on characters, right? So like once somebody finishes one character, they're making another. It repopulates the world. It repopulates the endgame dungeons, repopulates the early raids. This is the best organic way to make sure that people that normally would fall behind still have people to play with, right? If you have a friend that's falling behind, you can make an alt and play with him there, right? It's like the perfect solution. But if you have this super long, super dragged out grind, it's just going to ruin it for everybody. I promise you. I don't think that you think it will, but it will. This is one of those you don't think it will, but it will. That's basically my thoughts. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this. Even if you disagree with it, feel free to let me know in the comments and we'll hash it out there. But I'll talk to you guys later. And looking forward to BlizzCon. And was it 12 days? It's getting closer. So see you guys.